On today's Locked On Jayhawks, has Zeke Mayo been KU basketball's best player? That, according to Bill Self, plus the top performers according to Pro Football Focus for KU football in Week 1.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio, and you can listen or watch the show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. Thank you to the everydayers tuning in to each and every show, and thank you for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. And on today's episode of the show, we're going to be talking a little KU basketball because Bill Self was on a recent podcast with Seth Davis and talked about, had some interesting quotes. One of them was talking about Zeke Mayo and possibly being the team's best player. So we'll get into those on today's episode. Also a little KU football sprinkled in as we're going to go back and look at the top Pro Football Focus performers and what that can tell us for KU football after Week 1 against Lindenwood. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by Ultimate College Football Head Coach. It is the new mobile game that is completely free, has no ads, and is 100% playable offline. Use the promo code LOCKEDONCFB, all caps, inside the game store to receive a free boost to your program. Begin your coaching legacy today. So let's start here. Bill Self's comments on the Seth Davis Bleacher Report podcast, because there's some interesting quotes that Bill Self gave that we're going to get into, whether it's about some of the players on the team, some of the stuff from last year. So let's start here, because I think this one was the most notable, and this is going to be the headliner of our show today. This is the direct quote that he gave. Probably the one that doesn't get talked about that's been our best player so far is Zeke Mayo from South Dakota State. End quote. That was a direct quote from Bill Self to Seth Davis, kind of talking about, some of the offseason additions and what they brought in. Again, probably the one that doesn't get talked about that's been our best player so far is Zeke Mayo from South Dakota State. Now, there are things I talk about all the time, like sometimes things that coaches say to the media might reflect something that they are trying to get out there, that they are trying to hype somebody up, that they are trying to not give bulletin board advice to the opposition, right? And there are reasons to do that. There are good reasons to do that, right? There are some times where a coach might, boost up a player in a radio interview or a TV interview or something like that. Somebody who's not playing, because it's like, hey, we want them to know that they're making good progress out publicly and their parents to know and stuff, so that, they don't transfer at the end of the year, right? There's like a political game you have to play with it, which is probably not super fun as a head coach. But anyway, if you go back to like the banquet, and after the banquet, Bill Self said that like Zach Clements was the most improved player on the team. Now that's entirely possible. It is entirely possible, and that might be the case, right? It's also possible that Bill Self said some of those things because maybe there's some truth to it and you're expanding it out to try to avoid somebody transferring out of the program. Again, I'm not saying that is the case. I don't know, but that stuff does happen across the country, I guess is what I'm saying. And so could this be a comment by Bill Self? Not that Zeke Mayo is going to transfer. He's a senior. He's coming in for his last year, right? But to try to make Zeke Mayo be a more confident player, right? Like you're making that big step up from competition in the Summit League. And it's like, I maybe if you're Zeke Mayo, you're like, yeah, I think I'm doing pretty well, but it's like, I don't know for sure. These guys are really good. Like it's tough to make that transition. And you're Bill Self, you're going, hey, I want to instill confidence in the kid, which obviously would be a good thing. Maybe this is one way to do that. I don't know. But I don't know. That was kind of unprompted on his own billing. I don't really think it is that, to be honest. Now, do keep in mind that AJ Storr was playing for the Bahamian national team for a lot of the summer. So he was not around KU basketball for a lot of their, practices and scrimmages and stuff like that. So he obviously is now and has been, but that does make you wonder, okay, well, once AJ Storr has more time to catch up with like practice and the scheme and everything, that maybe he'll end up being that guy from that transfer class. Also, this was him talking about the transfers, so maybe that's him talking about being the best player among the transfers so far. I do think it's interesting, though, because obviously the impact of this, if it were true, I mean, if he is the best player on the team, period, if this is not just about the transfers, if it's everyone, what would that look like? I think it would look like him being your leading scorer. He would be starting next to DeJuan Harris. It would probably push like Rylan Griffin to the bench at that point. And he's probably giving you, 14, 15, maybe not leading scorer because you have Hunter, but 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 points per game. He's a dynamic three-point shooter. He's getting shots off the dribble. He's hitting deep shots. It's probably looking a little bit like Devontae Graham as a scorer, but because you have DeJuan Harris not getting the 7 assists per game or whatever Devontae averaged as a senior. That would obviously be very impactful for Kansas. The fact that he is playing well should make you more confident about what Kansas can be this season, because we know that if you're going to play a lineup that has Hunter Dickinson and KJ Adams and DeJuan Harris on the court next to each other, there's not a lot of three-point volume coming from those three players. And so you need players who can stretch the floor and open up the spacing. Well, if Zeke Mayo is playing well and is making that transition well, then boom, that's a good thing for Kansas that's going to open up the floor for everybody else. Now, if this is just among the transfers, maybe it doesn't go as far to say he's going to average 16, 17 points per game. But at the very least, like I said, you can understand why it would be that over Storr. And then you could say, but maybe that still means he would be the 5th starter over Rylan Griffin, and he's going to play over Shaquille Moore, right? Because that seemed to be kind of a conversation that, okay, Shaquille Moore is more of the defensive guy. Zeke Mayo is more of the offensive guy. Bill tends to lean toward defense, but maybe they get equal amount of minutes or about the same amount of minutes. But if this is the case, maybe it is more of Zeke Mayo. So I've always thought Zeke Mayo was going to be a helpful player for KU, and I loved watching Zeke Mayo in high school, loved watching him at South Dakota State. I've always thought he's going to make a positive impact and was a really good transfer addition for KU basketball. But as they continued to add more and more transfer players, it became more of a question for me of, okay, maybe he's more of your 6th man, right? Maybe he's more of your 7th man, something like that. But now I'm starting to kind of reignite the conversation where it's like, okay, maybe he is going to be your 5th starter. Maybe it is taking a little bit longer for Rylan Griffin to adjust, even though Griffin was playing at the power level. Griffin has a completely different system at Kansas than what Nate Oates runs at Alabama. And maybe Zeke Mayo is just hitting the ground running. So I think that's obviously good news for KU, but certainly was very interesting. And part of that too could be motivation, if we're going back to the motivation sentiment of it, for guys like AJ Storr to step up their game, or Shaquille Moore, whoever else, to step up their game for KU, Diggy Coit, right, whoever. Here's another interesting quote. Rakease is one of the sleepers. He later went on to say, kind of like Ochai Agbaji type kid. And if you do remember, obviously Ochai was playing on redshirt in that first year, but he ended up playing a decent amount of minutes once he pulled the redshirt that first year. So is Rakease Passmore the type of, I don't necessarily mean to go this far in terms of like Johnny Furphy and Kelly Oubre when I say those names, to say that he's going to be starting playing 30 minutes a night come conference play. But like the idea of, okay, Furphy and Oubre were playing way less minutes. By the time we got to conference play, those minutes boosted up, right? Maybe for Rakease Passmore, the difference there is in the non-con, you're playing 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes per game. And then come conference play, you're playing so well, you're playing 15 minutes per game. And then all of a sudden you're setting yourself up to come year 2. We're talking about Rakease Passmore being a starter and being like the breakout candidate for the team that could, be this all league player and all this sort of stuff, right? That's entirely possible. But I think that kind of makes sense. You have an athletic wing who's like 6'5". I think that gives you confidence about what he could future be as a shooter, because the athleticism in there. So that's exciting there. What does that mean for this year, though? I don't know. That could be more of a long-term thing, but I am excited for Rakease Passmore, whether it is this year or next year. Anyway, here's another interesting quote. Flory Bidunga is athletic and explosive as anybody. He later said, one of the best prospects we've had in a while. Now, it kind of makes sense, because even if you think about like the first-round picks that Kansas had recently, Ochai Agbaji, Christian Brown, those are developmental guys, right? They're guys that stayed in the program for a while. And to a certain standpoint, like Flory could be in that same ilk. Like he might be in college the same amount of time as Christian Brown was, because the center position, if you're not shooting, you end up staying in college a little bit longer. And also, I think the idea is going to be he stays in college at least 2 years. You're going to be backing up Hunter Dickinson this year. No, maybe he kills it so much in 12 minutes per game as a backup that it's just like, no, this kid needs to be a first-round pick. And that would be a great problem for Kansas staff, obviously. But it is interesting that you hear that type of comments. And I do think it's interesting from both lenses. One, that all the talk we keep hearing about Flory is about how good of a prospect he is. Does that tell you that maybe he is not fully ready right away? And Bill Self is trying to say, but it's going to come. Now, is he saying it's going to come this year? Is he saying it's going to come in the second year or in the third year? And maybe Zach Clemens ends up being the backup this year. Or is he just saying, I don't know when it's going to come, but it will come at some point, right? Those are kind of the questions that remain to be seen with everything with Flory Bidunga. But the fact that he has those types of high praise to put on him could tell you the ceiling. Now, I do remember a couple of years ago, there were very high comments about guys like Quentin Grimes, but you could say if Quentin Grimes would have stuck around for year 2, year 3 at Kansas, he turned into a first-round draft pick on a Houston Final Four team by year 3 as kind of a wing player that Kansas would have preferred him to be when he was there in year 1. if that's the idea with Flory Bidunga, that he's going to be here year 2, year 3, maybe he does kind of turn into that. So exciting news all around with some of those quotes and the newcomers for KU basketball. We got more quotes to get to. Top performers for KU football against Lindenwood, according to Pro Football Focus. We're going to break it all down on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. This episode of the show is brought to you by Ultimate College Football Head Coach. It's a brand new mobile game that I think you're going to love as much as I do. In this amazing game and simulation, you get to step into the shoes of a head coach and lead your college football program to glory. From recruiting players and hiring coaches to overseeing training camps, handling school scholarships, you control every crucial detail of your program, including calling plays for the offense during the game. So your strategy not only going to determine how your team does that specific game, but going to determine the future of your program. Going to be easier to recruit if your team's going 10-2, right? Ultimate College Football Head Coach is completely free. It has no ads. It's 100% playable offline, which is super nice. So if you're going on like a long trip, you're going on an airplane, you don't have to worry about being connected to Wi-Fi and paying $10 for a 2-hour flight. You can play on the go as you want and when you want to. And of course, we have a special offer for Locked On Jayhawk fans. Use the promo code LOCKEDONCFB. That's all caps inside the game store, and you receive a free boost to your program. Make sure to take advantage of this perk. It's going to get your team off to a strong start. To download the game, just visit ultimate-cfb.com. That's ultimate-cfb.com, or look it up on the app stores. Ultimate College Football Head Coach, begin your coaching legacy today. Continuing on with this episode of Locked On Jayhawks, and thank you again to tuning in. Don't forget you can make your second listen, Locked On College Football, to get you caught up with what happened in week 1 and looking ahead to week 2 this week on Locked On. Okay, more notable comments from Bill Self on the Seth Davis Bleacher Report podcast late last week. He said, last year we put ourselves in a situation that if everything went perfect, we could have made a deep run. Later said, I learned that too much is better than not enough. I think that's what you're seeing this year. I think that's what you're seeing with the late addition of David Coit, that you would much rather be in a situation where somebody's unhappy that they're the 9th man, that they're the 10th man. Like if you're Bill Self, you'd rather have to have conversations with guys about being, I don't know, happier in those situations or what you can do to earn more playing time than you would the alternative, which is trying to force somebody who is your 6th or 7th man to play better. Like Bill Self, he said it before, he loves using the bench as a teaching tool. Like that's been a comment he's given out there. And I think that's what you've kind of seen with this year's team. Is it a guarantee that it's all going to come together? It's all going to work? No, because like KU's had other teams that have been, I don't know, deep on paper when we come into the season. I think of the 2018-2019 team where it's like you had KJ Lawson as like your 9th or 10th man, and he was putting up like really good numbers the year before at Memphis. But that was just nobody could really find their role. I don't think they'll have their problem on this year's team because you have, 3 returning starters. So it makes it easier to kind of slot into roles and stuff like that. But I think that'll be something you see moving forward, especially now that the scholarship numbers are going to be 15 for basketball. I don't know that KU will, obviously they have to take one away next year anyway. But I don't know that they'll ever use all 15, but it gives them the option to bring in even more guys. And then just basically say at the end of the year, wherever the chips fall, like, if we have a couple players who we brought in and we thought maybe they could be the 8th man, they ended up being the 11th man or 10th man and they transfer at the end of the year, whatever, we'll bring in another transfer the next year, another freshman the next year, right? That's kind of, I think, where this is going. And he also talked about, like, you couldn't practice as much, and that's something they're going to be able to do. Like, I said this before, like, Diggy Coit, even if he's your 9th or 10th man and he's not playing 15 minutes every night for Kansas, he's going to be a hell of a practice player for KU, right? To really help out with your team and going up against some of these smaller guards who can really fill it up for KU and trying to defend against, pick and pops and pick and rolls and guards who can do that sort of stuff. I think that's going to be super helpful for KU in practice. This one I found very interesting as we consider more and more with the Zeke Mayo comments and some of this other stuff about what the rotation will be like for Kansas. And we'll have another update, another show with another update based on more that's happening, maybe some of these comments about what we think the rotation is looking like here, maybe in the next couple of weeks. But he said, quote, Hunter's minutes need to be 28. And so I think it makes sense, like a couple of reasons. Hunter Dickinson is going to be a better rebounder, a more energetic defender if he's playing 28 minutes as opposed to 32, 35, 36 minutes in a given game. Doesn't sound that big of a deal, 4 minutes in a given game, but like that's one extra chunk of the game where it's not just you're out of the game for 4 minutes, but that basically means a full TV timeout, right? You think TV timeout, 4 minute chunk, TV timeout. So like that could be 10, 15 minutes of real time. Seriously. So like that's a real break that you can have. And then you add up over the course of the season, playing 28 minutes as opposed to 32 minutes per game over the course of, if you play 40 games, which is obviously the hope, that's 160 minutes over the course of the season. That's 5 extra games that you're not playing. So it does make a big difference, those 4 minutes over the course of the season. Maybe 4 minutes once you get to March, like at that point you play the extra 4 minutes, it's whatever. Like over the course of the season, it does kind of add up a little bit there. And if it helps his defense, helps the rebounding and everything, obviously he was already a really good rebounder, but if it makes him from already a great rebounder to an even better one on the offensive end or something like that, I don't know. That can be helpful, but also they have the minutes to give out in theory. If Flory Bidunga and Zach Clements most improved player and Flory Bidunga is this great prospect, then you shouldn't have problem filling the backup 5. You can even throw KJ there in a pinch at the backup 5 minutes, right? So they shouldn't have problems filling that role. Might as well get those guys minutes, and I think it'll help Hunter Dickinson and everybody else too. Last quote I wanted to touch on here. He said, I think we'll go 9. This is Seth Davis talking about, okay, you have such a deep team. How deep are you going to go? You're going to go 9, 10 guys deep. Bill Self said, I think we'll go 9. I don't know that we'll go 10. I never play 10. Good self-awareness there. And we did the conversation talking about, the depth that they play. Typically it's like closer to 8, but there have been years that we talked about. If you're an everydayer, you caught it with the past shows where they have gone to 9. And maybe this team is trending that way. And I think that makes it a little bit easier to project the rotation if you are getting to 9, because we know the guys who are going to play, right? I mean, the 3 returning starters with KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson, and DeJuan Harris, like, okay, you're going to be starting again. AJ Storr, Ryland Griffin, Zeke Mayo, whatever role between, I guess, Mayo and Griffin, like, is starting or coming off the bench, like, they're all going to play. You look at whoever the backup center is, Flory or Zach, right? There's 7 guys. So now you're left with 2 spots with Shaquille Moore, who I think is going to play because he's a good defender. He's trusted, older player, ball handler. You got Diggy Coit out there. You got Rakease Passmore. You got, if you want to play another one of these centers. I feel like I'm forgetting somebody too. Like, point being, the numbers run out very quickly. So if you're getting to 9, I think that would be a good thing for KU over the course of the season. But once it gets into game action, we'll see if that holds true. Because all of a sudden you get into the North Carolina game or the Champions Classic or playing Duke, and it's like 6 or 7 guys, the most trusted guys for Bill Self. And we'll see how that goes over the course of the season. All right, KU football took down Lindenwood on last Thursday, 48-3. Let's look back to that game. Who are some of the top performers according to Pro Football Focus, and what does that tell us for the rest of the season for KU football? Our episode today is brought to you by 5 Hour Energy. You're tired after lunch, right? You hit that lull. You had a big lunch after having a long morning, and now you're kind of dozing off. Well, you're not alone. In fact, research shows that more than 70% of us hit the wall after lunch. Let a 5 Hour Energy shot help you leap over that wall instead of crashing into it. With 0 sugar in a convenient portable size, it's the perfect pick-me-up for getting stuff done. The 5 Hour Energy website has flavors galore: watermelon, tropical burst, grape, berry, and more. There's a flavor for everyone. Try them all or just load up on one flavor, because on the site, you even have the option to build your own 12-pack or 24-pack. You choose the flavor or flavors, and it's delivered right to your door. If you go to 5hourenergy.com, that's the number 5hourenergy.com, and get some 5 Hour Energy product today, you can use my promo code LOCKEDONCFB to receive 20% off your order. This offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions. This code is not good on subscription orders. Just go to 5hourenergy.com today. Finishing things up on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks with KU football's best PFF scores for the KU Lindenwood game. We'll have throughout the week more conversation about the KU Lindenwood game, look ahead to KU Illinois game. We'll get into which players have to step up for KU to beat Illinois. We'll have our preview. We'll have our postcast after the game on Saturday night for the KU Illinois game as well. So make sure you subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast. All right. So KU football's top PFF scores against Lindenwood. Here's the top 5 offensive players. Luke Grimm, who had a 91.1. Jalen Daniels, who had a 90.5, which I think is interesting because you look at like QBR, it was closer to being even because of the bad interception. But PFF is basically saying, yeah, that might have been a miscommunication with the receiver. And also, like, besides that, he did everything else great, which I think is interesting. Calvin Clements had an 88.8. That was good to see. Only 14 snaps, a little less than the starters, but he played really well. Logan Brown had an 88.6, which is interesting because I don't know if he was hurt or he got benched at one point because he kind of went out and then came back in, but PFF was like, no, he killed it. And then Bryce Cabledew had an 88.2. So that's got to make you feel good about the 2 tackles and where they're at, that Brown and Cabledew. Obviously, the competition is going to get better, and we'll see how that goes. But at least in the first game, looked pretty good. The bottom 5 on offense, you had 3 tight ends in there: Jaden Ham, LJ Arnold, Lincoln Cure, or Leighton Cure, sorry, Nolan Gorchika and Jared Casey. And I don't necessarily agree with the Cure and Casey ones on here. I think for a long time, PFF has had a difficult idea of tracking just how impactful like Jared Casey's blocks have been. And I think you look at what Leighton Cure did. Leighton Cure was basically a carbon copy of Jared Casey in this game. They were both opening up holes. They were both like two of KU's rushing touchdowns were behind Casey and Cure. They were setting the key blocks on things to happen. So I think they played better than the PFF grade, right? Some of it you take with a grain of salt, some of it you trust, whatever. You kind of have to use your eyes and use this as a tool as opposed to just the be all end all. Also the Arnold one, like him being lower there, one, doesn't worry me because he's a great player, but two, also probably just because of like a lack of opportunities. Like if he would have got more targets, probably would have had a higher PFF grade. So those are the ones there. Other notables for the offense, I found this interesting. Kansas had 5 offensive linemen who were above an 80 on PFF grade in this game. The 3 mentioned, Clements, Brown, Cabledew, and then you also had Michael Ford and Bryce Foster, and they had 3 others, so 8 total offensive linemen who were graded a 70 or above. Basically 60 to 69, somewhere in that range is basically just like an average, like, starter. So you're getting like good production from 8 linemen. That's awesome. And all 5 of the starting offensive linemen were 74 better. Great performance. Again, much easier opponent, so we'll see how it carries over, but you'd prefer to be talking about that and being like, well, we'll see how it carries over the rest of the games. Then, oh no, they got smoked by Lindenwood, and that's not good because they're an FCS team, right? What about defense? Top 5 defense, you had OJ Burroughs. He had a 91.2. He had an awesome game. He was targeted 5 times. He gave up 1 catch for -1 yard. And I don't always know that I trust the target numbers on PFF for safeties because I think some of it, I don't know how it divvies out when like the safety's in zone, and what if the safety is supposed to be playing cover 2 and has to cover for somebody because they mess up a coverage, and so it looks like you're playing cover 3 and then they get dinged for I don't know how they know that stuff, but that's cool that it happened. And I thought, watching it, he played a great game. Mello Dotson 90.8, that makes sense. He was killer, had some awesome tackles, had the pick 6 and everything. JB Brown had an 86.8. Cornell Wheeler had an 85.5. So that makes you feel good about where those 2 middle linebackers are coming in and thump you. And then Tristan Fletcher, one of the backup linebackers, at a 79.8. So good about the linebackers there. The bottom 5 on defense, Logan Brantley. That was just 1 snap, though. Hard to judge that too much. Jason Gilliam in 8 snaps. So again, limited snaps there. That's not a great sign to see, though, with one of your starters. You had McGee in 11 snaps. They were all below 50. And then you had, that was Ron McGee, by the way. And then you had DJ Warner, who was above a 50, By Job, who was a 55, both in the bottom 5. Again, if you're having bottom 5 performers still at 50 and 55, that's a good problem to have. But also those guys are young, so I'm not worried about that at all. They're going to get better as it goes on. The young guys are the case where it's like, for most players, if you're a veteran, it's like, if you didn't do it against Lindenwood, it's going to be hard for you to do it later in the season. For the young guys, it's like, no, if you didn't do it against Lindenwood, it's just probably yourself. You're young. You're going to get better as the season goes on. So not a big worry there. Other notables on the defense, the KU, I found this interesting in the passing game. KU linebackers were targeted 11 times, which I think is going to happen a lot this season. KU has these 2 stud corners. They've got good safeties, good depth in the corner room as well. Linebackers are going to get targeted. Teams are going to throw to the running backs. They're going to throw to the tight ends. They're going to throw to slot receivers and stuff. And KU linebackers were targeted 11 times. They give up 9 catches on the 11. So that's not great. Now, the good news, though, they only give up 52 yards. So if you're saying you're targeted 11 times and you're giving up 52 yards, less than 5 yards per catch, I mean, if you're giving up under 5 yards per throw attempt, I guess I should say, you're going to be like the best pass defense in the country. So that actually would be good, but you gave up a lot of completions. So what I'm just going to be tracking this moving forward, because what I think is interesting is that when you're playing better teams, when you're playing teams who have better running backs, better slot receivers, better tight ends, players who can make you miss, what happens when you give up catches on 9 of 11 attempts? Do those turn into bigger yardage plays because the players with the football are able to make bigger plays than what Lindenwood was able to? Or is this a good sign that the pass defense was actually okay and they really only gave up stuff on like checkdowns? That'll just be something we're kind of targeting moving forward. The other one, the next best performer on the top 5 that we didn't get to was Blake Harold. He had a 76.3. Redshirt freshman D tackle. We heard some good stuff in camp that he was making moves, but I thought it was going to be moves like Tommy Dunn and DJ Withers, that they were slowly making progress. Eventually, by the time you get to a redshirt sophomore, you're playing, maybe you're starting, and then now both players looking to break out this year for KU. But Harold was playing a lot of snaps, had a good PFF grade right away. He might be higher up on that depth chart than you might have imagined. And also, Harold would have been followed by Dean Miller, who had a 72.4 PFF grade. He had 4 pressures that led KU. Jeremy Robinson was second with 3 of them. Overall, KU had 14 pass pressures. They gave up just 5, so that's a good place to be, a +9 for that game. But let's see if Dean Miller, let's see if Blake Harold, let's see if these guys can do it against a much better Illinois offensive line this week. We'll get more into that game and plenty more coming at you this week on Locked On Jayhawks. Make sure you're subscribed anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page. We'll see you next time with LOJ.